Hey everyone, and welcome back. Now today I wanted to go over ICP, and specifically I want to talk about the tokenomics and kind of more importantly kind of the inflation statistics of ICP, just because realistically I think that's kind of the main complaint, or I guess maybe a kind of boiled down version of the main complaint that I receive regarding ICP is that ultimately the price action is terrible, and the price doesn't do very well, it doesn't pump very hard. And there's a couple different reasons I think I've identified as to potentially why that might be, and what potentially we could do of like how to fix it, and also is it even a problem kind of in the first place. And so anyway, let's go ahead and dive right in. So starting out, looking at crypto bubbles, what we can see kind of across the market, it's a very green day overall. We can see ICP up about 6%, kind of the ones leading the market being about, kind of in the 12 to 14% range roughly. So, obviously very, very green day in the crypto market. Everything has kind of jumped kind of together. There's, a couple that have kind of started to pull back a little bit here. I mean, the only really main one of note is SPX, and this one has moved like huge amounts. So realistically, a 10% pullback is not anything too concerning at all. So overall, very strong day in the market. ICP obviously not leading the market, but doing relatively well compared to some of the other things. I would say kind of sitting about right on par with what we could consider maybe like the market average. So looking at the chart here, we can see a couple of different things with ICP. From a kind of large macro perspective, obviously I've drawn out several lines of kind of major support and resistance. What we can see is there are a couple spots here and here, kind of most importantly, that are pretty close together. I'm not sure, kind of as I've said on the channel before, some of these spots really don't work as like lines per se, but rather zones. And so something like this, I could even almost consider, kind of more of a liquidity zone rather than like two distinct lines of like support and resistance. Because what we can see is we've seen wicks kind of down and through this zone kind of all throughout. So, kind of between like the, $10.24 and maybe like $11 range, this is all kind of I would say a pretty like fresh liquidity zone. Actually, I'll probably even just delete these lines because it makes it look a little bit cleaner. But this is kind of what I would expect to see, kind of from this range. But here we can see, some relatively distinctive points of support and resistance here and there. Again, even still, this area also appears like it could be more of a liquidity zone. But overall, what we can see is down at this level, we've seen a pretty decent bit of like volume and support as we've come down kind of since the middle of June. We saw obviously a little bit of a break over here, above $10, and then recently like we almost hit $10. Actually, we did just barely hit over $10 on this chart, which is good. We can see that volume kind of continues to go down. So, retail and kind of large volume interest still does not appear to be back in any meaningful way. If we were kind of to break below this $6 range, I would say kind of a move down to like 480s is probably kind of where we would find our next large point of resistance or support. I don't really think that's going to happen just based on what we're seeing kind of on the macro structure. If we zoom in a little bit, kind of look at the shorter time frame, we can see that we have consolidated in this zone pretty well. Given kind of how close we are to the US election, I don't really see, or I don't really expect, I guess I should say, too much going on within this. I would imagine we kind of trade between the $6.80 and $10, I guess $11 range between now and then. And honestly, it would not even surprise me if we're sitting between kind of like the $7.80 and like $8.60 range and kind of in the super, super tight band. Just because with all the uncertainty up until the election, things like that, I don't expect that we'll be seeing a whole lot, but anything could happen. Right now we're kind of sitting fairly comfortably within the Bollinger Band. So based on, kind of what we're seeing on the chart here, things do look pretty good. Obviously we're seeing higher highs and higher lows, a little bit of consolidation going on here, but this does look like we could be primed to see a breakout here on ICP relatively soon. If this is something that you're wanting to trade, whether on like a spot exchange to just buy and accumulate more ICP, or if you are looking to take more leveraged positions, you can do all of this on Blowfin. Blowfin actually reached out to me and they offered a pretty nice like sign up bonus for any of you guys who are interested and willing to get starting to trade. You'll be getting a $30 bonus as well as 50% discounts on spot fees. So if you are trying to accumulate more ICP, this could be a pretty interesting way to do it. This does run until October the 24th, so you do still have about 10 days to get signed up if that is something that you're interested in. If not, no worries. Obviously leverage trading can be dangerous, but also even if you already have, you like to use Coinbase or some other centralized exchange, totally fine. Either way works, but I just figured with this bonus that they offered new users of mine that sign up, this could be something that some of you may be potentially interested in. So if you are, I'll have the link in the description below. You can go get signed up that way. So moving into the topic of today, I want to talk about kind of the general state of ICP's tokenomics. There's a lot of different things that play into it. The three main things are going to be token unlocks from like early investors and stakers, things like that. The second is going to be voting rewards. Third is going to be like node provider rewards. So the first one is kind of a two-pronged with both token unlocks from investors as well as stakers. And so right now we'll just start with looking at investors. This is kind of the overall allocation of tokenomics, and we can kind of see how the early rounds were played out. So we can see we got private sale, foundation, the team, early backers, strategic round pre-sale, the ICP association, partnerships, advisors, airdrops, and then grants and some of these smaller amounts. But what we can see is that the biggest chunk that had a vesting schedule was the seed/private sale, and that had basically almost 24% of total token supply at almost 116 million ICP. And we can see this actually ends in June of 2025. So we are getting relatively close to the end of this. We still do have about 16% locked, which does equate to about 3% of the total supply. So, still a decent chunk more to unlock here. This does pose a relatively large risk of people selling, but not necessarily like a guarantee that will happen. Then we can also see, the other 53% is untracked. These are kind of the main token unlocks that have come. The majority of it, like we can see, early backer, strategic round pre-sale, and airdrops, all of this has unlocked already. So we just have kind of that remaining 16% of the private sale that still is to be unlocked. The second piece that I want to take a look at is what is locked up in staking, because staking is kind of the other big sink that ICP tokens are sitting in currently. And what we can see is there's almost 240 million ICP that is locked up, and that equates to 45, almost 46% of the total supply. So essentially almost half of the ICP tokens are actually locked up currently. What we can see is that, the majority of them, 202 million, are staked and they're not dissolving. But these are people who are unstaking early from kind of their required commitment or their I guess committed time. And so we can see that there's almost 37 million that are unstaking there. And so that'll be happening, over the next little period. These will be getting unlocked. But overall, given that almost half of the supply is locked up, that does put a pretty decent constraint on the supply as far as liquidity is concerned. And so this is something that could have a pretty outsized impact on the market, right? Because if ICP goes up, you have to look at the amount of people who are willing to sell, right? And one of the claims that is made fairly consistently by the ICP community is that a large majority of the tokens, in terms of distribution, ICP is one of the most well distributed. We see some of these meme tokens that run to multi-billion-dollar market caps. A lot of those will have 50, 60, 70, 80% of the total token supply held within the hands of insiders. And so that, obviously is not decentralized at all. And it gives those insiders or those key stakeholders a lot of leverage to essentially nuke the chart, right? And this is kind of a double-edged sword. A lot of the people at ICP are not happy with this, and they think this poses a risk to the ecosystem from a long-term perspective, which I would completely agree. However, there is the other side to that argument, which is when you have such a massive majority of that supply constrained, it allows the price to run a lot easier, right? Because if you own 90% of the supply and you have no plans on selling until $1 billion market cap, only 10% of the supply can realistically be traded around, and that impacts the total price appreciation, obviously, because of supply and demand. If you have 100 million people fighting over 10 million tokens when the total supply is 100 million, that price is going to go up much quicker than 100 million people fighting over 100 million tokens. And so, usually these manipulated projects do see these ridiculous appreciations in price because the supply is so concentrated, and usually the liquidity float is so small. ICP, given that it is so well distributed, kind of has that disadvantage, I guess you could maybe call it, in the sense that there's a lot of people who would be willing to sell at various different points. If the whole community isn't aligned in the fact that, we're not selling below $1,000 per token, well then, you have people that might be taking it 10%, 50%, 100%, 200%, right? Not everybody's going to hold for 100x, which makes it a lot more difficult for the price to appreciate. So looking here, we can see that ICP actually has a circulation dashboard, and they give you almost complete clarity into kind of how this, the inflation of the ecosystem works, which I think is really, really nice because it makes it very easy for us to kind of dive into how like specifically these things are working. And so we can see a couple of different things. So first off, we can see that there is an annual inflation rate of 6.63% through voting rewards. Done, right? Okay, now we know that ICP's inflation rate is 6.63% a year, right? Well, not quite, because there's a couple of different things going on. And so the first thing that we can see here is there's undispersed and dispersed voting rewards. So there's almost 90 million ICP that technically have been earned, but have not been dispersed because they aren't actually paid out in ICP directly. They're paid out in neurons, and then that can be converted into ICP. And so what we can see is, dispersed is almost 42 million ICP. And we can see even just so far in this month, I guess it's not going to show October yet, but in September, there was almost 1 million ICP that was paid out, an accumulative amount of 40 million. And so, I guess so far in October, we can see almost 825,000. This fluctuates because people do have to claim it. And so obviously, like what we can see here in, August of 2022, there's 2.7 million paid out, where in, something like, May of 2023, there was only, just under 400,000 paid out. So the next piece with this whole inflation statistic is we have the node provider rewards. Now, the node provider rewards, as we can see, are much smaller than what we get from voting rewards, but they still are paid out nonetheless. And we can see, recently it's been kind of on the range of about 400,000 ICP. Now, this happens mid-month, and so I believe that we've already actually seen this happen for October. And so that kind of the next bit that we'll see will be in November. The node provider rewards are a little bit difficult for me to understand. So if any of you guys have like more context or an explanation as to how these work, I'd love to hear it, because ultimately, what this like question or like information box says is essentially is like, this is the amount minted for ICP providers for the purpose of like rewarding the nodes, right? Rewards are typically minted in the middle of the month. Node provider rewards are typically fixed per node per month in fiat terms. That's why we see this amount fluctuating, is because the fiat terms are like different here. And so that's kind of like one of the core pieces to this is, this does fluctuate, and it's kind of hard for me to understand exactly how these are getting paid out. Sorry, all the dashboards went away for a second, but anyway, what we can see is, in just October so far, we've seen, 368,000 paid out to node providers, and then for voting rewards, and just in October, we can see about 825,000. So about 1.2 million ICP injected into the ecosystem just for the month of October. Now, what we can also see here is there's this kind of last component, which is the number of ICP burned. And now, the thing that I actually find really interesting about the ICP ecosystem is it kind of has this like fluctuating market dynamic, very similar to Ethereum in terms of, there is this ICP injected into the ecosystem primarily via voting and node provider rewards. But the second piece is when people are actually hosting apps on the ICP ecosystem, they have to pay to have their like apps hosted on the ecosystem. And this causes kind of a jump in the amount of ICP burned. And so the more people using the ecosystem, the more ICP is burned. What we can see is total through the lifetime of ICP, there's about 350,000 burned. At the beginning of September, there's about 174, and now there's about 350. So we essentially, we've seen this double within the past like month and a half or so, and that has been due to, some continued adoption of the ICP ecosystem and some more activity happening on it. But ultimately, it's continued to trend up. Like obviously back in, 2022, early 2022, we saw a little spike, and then things basically flattened out a little bit. What we can see here is obviously we saw quite the massive jump here, but it's continued to kind of go up relatively linearly so far. And so this is something, in my opinion, that looks pretty good. And so ultimately, we now get into this, like, all of this is very much producing like a mixed rate in terms of inflation, right? Because what we do know is that voting rewards are currently at 6.63%. It will come down to 5% as kind of the projected by 2029. But at least right now, we're at 6.63, but it's not all paid out because there's, you essentially have to claim it. So that means that, potentially we could have a lower like real rate of inflation, even though the potential rate could be higher. Same thing with, node providers. That's going to add in addition to, all of the like voting rewards. This is in addition, but then you also have kind of the negative component to it, which is the ICP burned. Now, at this point, the amount of ICP burned is almost inconsequential compared to the amount of ICP introduced into the system. It's like almost like not even worth figuring. But it is important to note that the trend here, right? Recently, we have seen this go up like a massive amount within the past month or so. Now, obviously, even if we take the past month, we've increased almost 200,000 ICP within the past 45 days, you could say. Well, within the past month, we've added in 1.2 million ICP into the ecosystem. So there is very much like a lot of new ICP being entered into the ecosystem, which is why we can kind of see like over a long enough time frame on ICP that it started at $400 and essentially has kind of deflated away down to about the $8 that we're sitting at right now. So I think this is kind of the general complaint of people who are ICP haters. And it's a valid complaint, right? I do think that what we're seeing with kind of all of this stuff happening, ICP is still very much in an inflationary ecosystem. And until there is the demand, that you're essentially going to have people who are continuously deflating or inflating the price, potentially dumping. For example, the ICP node providers, they may have a reason to sell their ICP to fund fiat because a lot of these guys are hosting nodes that need upkeep in like real fiat terms, right? And so they have to continuously dump their, just like Bitcoin miners, they have to continuously dump their earnings in order to, continue new tech upgrades, the just overall like implementation and consistency of like running their, their operation, all of that type of stuff. So there's a lot here that essentially is kind of factoring into this, which is why there's been such a strong and sustained selling pressure on the market. However, if we continue to see this type of thing happen, the metrics start to change very quickly, right? Obviously, there have been, if you've been at all on like the ICP, like, X and all that type of stuff, there have been incredibly like minor amounts of time where ICP has technically become deflationary. And that's mainly because this stuff is not counted over time. But the narrative still goes that like things are changing, right? And the biggest bet as an ICP like supporter you would be taking is that usage on the platform continues to grow, which means the number of ICP burned continues to go up, which means that the real rate of inflation continues to decrease and potentially even goes deflationary. Obviously, we would need a ton of usage and adoption for that to happen realistically, but that's definitely still like a very much possible play. We can see this, if you've seen any of my like previous Ethereum videos, you can see that Ethereum operates very much the same way. They were deflationary until kind of the worst of the bear market hit, and then they became inflationary again. And so, the same thing can happen to Ethereum just like it can happen to ICP. And so that's kind of the main thing that I want to cover. The last thing that I want to get into here was the ICP supply. Now, the ICP supply, we can see, is essentially how you can back into a real rate of inflation. Because what you can see is from a year ago, the total supply was about 508 million ICP. Today, the total rate is about 524 million. So I've used my calculator and essentially plugged these numbers in. We've inflated about 16.5 million ICP from this year to from last year to right now. And that over the total supply works out to about a 3.25% inflation rate. Really not that bad, especially when we're taking some of these mixed metrics of node providers plus the voting rewards, and the voting rewards being, over 6%. It really doesn't look too bad overall. And so, that there obviously it is still very much inflating, and inflation is going to produce consistent selling pressure on the market. This is kind of the whole basis of like fiat currency as well. They continually inflate the currency, which continually devalues the purchasing power of the people who hold it. And so this is kind of the main concern of people who are like ICP haters, I guess you could say. It's if this continues to inflate into infinity, which theoretically it could, there's just no reason to hold it ever, right? Like there might be reason to use it, and there might be reason to stake it because you're going to be getting some of that like inflationary reward, but you can't really just like, if you're just sitting there holding it in a wallet, like that's not really a great like long-term plan. The other thing we also have to note is if ICP burning doesn't continue to go up, then also, that obviously means the product isn't being adopted. And then there becomes some of this issue of like, well, is the ecosystem really ever going to catch on? And ultimately, when you have a project or a product like ICP, the ecosystem and the usage and kind of the network effect really, really does matter a lot. And so, obviously the technology of ICP seems very, very good, and it is very, very good in terms of what it can deliver. But ultimately, you have to have users. And so this is where, kind of, I think if I were to kind of like communicate my biggest complaint of ICP, the biggest complaint that I have of ICP, or the biggest concern, I guess I would say, is not the tokenomics, it's not the technology, it's the marketing. ICP is incredibly challenging to understand. A lot of people just either don't know about it or don't understand it. And ultimately, like, that's on ICP, right? If like they're trying to get people to use their ecosystem and to adopt their product, they should teach people how to use it, and they should get it in front of people. Marketing is just as much how you build a winning product as the technology. If you've got the best technology in the world with nobody that knows about it, you're going to lose. Where you could have the worst product in the world with great marketing and you might win. There are thousands of examples of how this has happened in real life and through different historical contexts. And so this is something that could happen to ICP as well, even though the technology is really, really good. And so to me, I guess like that remains to be my biggest like question mark or concern concerning ICP, is just more of the like marketing, the like, market awareness, the sales, like all of like getting people aware of and converted onto ICP is the biggest like hurdle that remains, in my opinion. So anyway, hopefully you found the information in this video useful. If you did, please do give me a like and subscribe. It really, really does help me out and continue to grow this channel. And ideally, kind of help instruct and teach people and kind of spread the news about ICP, because ultimately like that's the main thing that I think is missing. And I'm hoping that maybe my channel could help kind of spread that word in a way. And so, if you do want to support me, a like and subscribe really does help out. Also, there were some things that I had some questions on, mainly, how node providers are compensated is kind of the biggest one. So if you have any like feedback or thoughts or comments, anything regarding anything in the video, please feel free to leave me a comment in the comment section below. It really, really does help me out. Also, if you guys are wanting to trade ICP or even just kind of, buy and accumulate more, you can feel free to use my Blowfin link in the description below, as that'll help you out a little bit. Thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next video.